Well, I confess that when I prepare sermons, often I struggle with the ending of how to end a sermon. And sometimes I feel a bit like, a bit in Forrest Gump, where at the end of everything he says, and that's all I have to say about that. I have this mind, in my mind, there's going to be this dramatic, memorable end, and it's slightly hard, or I feel like a plane coming into land. So just a confession of sometimes how sermon prep goes for me. I used to find introductions hard as well, sort of like trying to find a way into this sort of interesting place there, but how do you find your way in? So the way I tend to prepare is backwards. I try and summarise, I know James does something similar, is I try and bring everything down, understand what this is about, how it applies to us, bring it down to a nub, and then I start with the end, and then the middle, and then the introduction. I start in the middle, and always finish with the introduction. And the reason I mention that is, as you glance through the book of Numbers, it seems that Moses has the same problem. He starts the book with a load of numbers. And then we saw why that was, and that will make sense. But then, as we've gone through, it's this fascinating book with dramatic narrative. And then we've seen the sort of weird bits are actually very instructive as well, and more relevant than we perhaps thought. I just come back from speaking at a homeschool camp, and I actually just did the weird bits of Numbers, and tied in with some other bits as well. But all this stuff, all these dramatic stories, all the things that it's been teaching us, and then just sort of peters out with this chapter. Or does it? Actually, it's a great way to end. It ties up the book of Numbers. It ties up the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. There's another book left, Deuteronomy, sort of a summary of everything. And actually for us, very much for us as well. It's the second major section on the daughters of Zelophehad. And I have to write it down in full because I can't remember his name and how to pronounce it. And if someone said, what do you do at your church? Yesterday, said, we did about the daughters of Zelophehad. And when they go, say it was the second sermon on them, because we did one earlier. If you were asked the names of those who you'd associate with the book of Numbers, I'm guessing from here, you'd probably get Moses, Miriam, Aaron, probably get Joshua and Caleb. Some of you might have got Phinehas. Probably you wouldn't get, or not many people would get, Mahlah, Tirzah, Hoglath, Milcah, and Noah. Noah, the girl's name, not the boy's name. And I would have got them if I had jotted them down here. And yet they're mentioned more than most. There's 2 chapters in the book of Numbers just about those 5 women. Now here's a summary of the chapter. The chiefs of the tribe of Joseph go to Moses and ask about the lands that's going to be given out by lot. And they remind him of the instructions we've already had about the daughters of Zelophehad, that they must have an inheritance too. But what happens if they marry outside of the clan? So they kind of, the leaders of the tribe are saying, look, do you remember this teaching with this thing we've already decided about, that the Lord has spoken about? Right, remember, so we've got to do it. A great idea. How does it work out in practice? Because when Jubilee comes, how do we get our land back if they marry outside the clan? Now, the Jubilee is every 50 years. It's a Sabbath of Sabbath, 7 times 7 plus 1. Every 50 years, they're sold. If that land has been sold, perhaps because of debt, whatever it is, all land returns to the ancestral roots, unless it's inherited land. Land is inherited, stays with the family. Now, why is that a problem? It sounds a little bit technical. We'll see in a moment. But imagine, in the UK, things work very differently, don't they, to what's described here. But we have 4 nations. But every time you married from a different nation, as I did, that bit of the nation goes to another. So Glad is an only daughter. So imagine she inherited land. Then we marry. It comes into my family, and it be inherited to Josiah. And the problem you'd have after a few generations is the UK, instead of being these 4 nations, would be a tapestry, because now there's a bit of England and Scotland. And the Scots say that anyway, they call it Edinburgh. But you can see how the integrity of the tribes would be eroded. It would undo their inheritance. So the chiefs are saying, okay, this is a great principle, it's from the Lord, but how does it work in practice? And the answer is, the daughters of Zelophehad must marry within their clan. And no clans can have inheritance be transferred. You can't have a bit of Dan being inherited by a bit of Asher, and so on. So Scotland stays Scotland, England stays England, the equivalent of that. So the daughters of Zelophehad complied, and they marry some people who they're related to, not immediately related to, but people who they have relatives, people within their clan. And we notice the book ends, verse 13, they're on the edge of the land. They're literally on the edge of the Jordan. The promised land is just over there. So that's the summary of the chapter. You might be thinking, okay, not sure that was a grand finale. It seems an odd way to end, but there's 4 reasons why it matters to the book, 4 reasons why it matters to us. So firstly, they're an example of faith. Secondly, we had to do this a bit in the book, it's about looking back. Thirdly, it's about looking forward. And fourthly, it's about thinking about our land that God has for us. So firstly, it's an example of faith. So the daughters of Zelophehad, we've seen already, are a great example. They provide a contrast to some of the other characters we've met. Most of the main characters are mixed, and some of them mentioned by name are not even mixed, they're a disaster. But these are 5 faithful women. We're only told good things about them. Now, it's interesting how people write about them. So some take them as evidence of a sort of proto-feminism, and others show us how bad the Bible is for being horrible and patriarchal. Now, the reason for those 2 extremes, which are both wrong ways of understanding it, but is in chapter 27, they come to Moses demanding land. But then here, they submit to God's word via Moses about marriage limitations. They're demanding and they're submissive. And this is why they're a good example. They demand God's blessing. They want to experience God's promise. They don't see why they should miss out because of their father's sin. And they're right. The Lord affirms that they're right. They demand blessings, but they don't demand their rights. For the good of the whole, they obey this marriage rule. Had they married outside, their inheritance would start to break up. And this is what we're to be like, I think, that we are to want what God promises, to want his blessings, to want him, to be, in that sense, demanding of God. But my preferences, my rights, fade into the background for the good of the wider church. That we make some sacrifice for a greater good. So in this case, they can marry anyone that seems good to them, Moses says, but within their clan. Now, it's worth pausing on that and applying that, because there's a few places in the Bible to consider about who we should marry. And we have far more choice than the daughters of Zelophehad had. But they have to be the Lord's. We marry within the Lord's. There's all sorts of wisdom issues about that come into it. That's for you to sort out, but we're limited to marry the Lord's. And if a particular congregation is too narrow a port, well, we need to think about how we deal with that. So they're full of faith, and their faith leads to an obedience. But not just an obedience, but they want to experience what God is holding out for them. And they provide for us in the book of Numbers a contrast with most of the men we meet in Numbers. And then they go on to become wives who model how to be Christ's bride. We'll come to that in a moment, because wives and brides are never far from the surface in the book of Numbers, and we'll see why that is. Secondly, they help us to look back. These daughters help us to look back. They're mentioned in chapter 27, and Zelophehad is mentioned in chapter 26. So 26 and 27, and here 36, is like brackets that hold a chunk of material together. I've just said that they're examples and models to copy, and specifically they are models of the second generation. And the second generation is better than the first. So the first generation in the book of Numbers, they are the generation that has come out of Egypt God has done wonderful things to them and for them. But they're characterized by moaning, doubt, and fear. Do you remember they keep on saying things like, oh, in Egypt, we had leeks. We've got boring manna from heaven here. But God's rescued them out of slavery and taken them to the promised land. But they moan, and they doubt, they fear. The second generation, in contrast, has been modelled by obedience and faith and godly risk-taking. And in the case of the daughters of Zelophehad, they thirst for God. They want to get into that promised land. They are best. They're the best. So the daughters of Zelophehad are the best of a good crop. Generally, this generation is better, but this is the example. This is what's going to typify this generation. They're not perfect, but they're an improvement on their parents. But not just look over the second generation, but over the whole book. If you remember Numbers chapter 1, book of Numbers, there was lots of numbers, and how the tribes are organised so they're ready for the journey. Now they're on the edge of the land, they're organised in those groups, and they're about to have land allocated to each of those groups. But it helps us to go back even earlier than chapter 1, to right back to the beginning of the Bible. So there are 10 generations between Adam and Noah. Boy Noah, not girl Noah, daughter of Zelophehad. 10 generations, Adam to Noah. 10 generations from Noah to Terah, Abraham's dad, and then 10 generations from Terah to the daughters of Zelophehad. So that's 10 generations from Eden to the flood, 10 generations from the flood to the promised land, and then the promised land is a new Eden, a new way back to God. And it shows us that God will achieve his purposes despite our failure. He will restore us to the new Eden. How? Well, we can look back at the cross and the resurrection, which secures our future. I think also it's an encouragement of how we pass on the faith from generation to generation. Say to the generation below us, look, just be better than we were. Look at our mistakes, do a better job. So we look back to the cross and the resurrection, and it gives us hope and assurance for the future. So it looks the example that we look back and we look forward. The last verse in this book has us looking out across the river towards Jericho, the promised land, and we can taste it. And you think, well, what a good place to end, that the wilderness is finished and they're there, and now they just wander in, don't they? But there is a problem. There's a number of problems. They have a major river to cross. On the other side of the river, there's a fortified city, and then all these armies on the other side. The job is not done at all. But we end Numbers optimistically. Why? Because the second generation isn't like the first, especially the daughters of Zelophehad. So if everyone is like them, we're going to get through all these problems. So this generation lived by faith, not by sight. The first generation, the spies go into the land and say, oh, the land's amazing, but we can't go in. It's too hard. And they're discouraged, and their discouragement spread through everyone else, as we saw. It's all too hard. It's just easier to stay here. Even better to go back to Egypt. And all over the first 5 books of the Bible is this theme that keeps on coming up, that we live by faith and not by sight. We live by trusting God's word, even if it's counterintuitive, even if it's harder in the short term. We don't live by common sense, because there are times to live by common sense, but not in matters of faith, because we don't see everything. And that's why we live by faith and by the words that come from the Lord. And that sometimes means stepping up, not quite knowing where we're going to land. It means sometimes a risk. And other themes that keep popping up, particularly in Numbers, is wives. Here are our 5 wives before us. And it reminds us about Israel as God's wife and the church as Christ's bride. So if you look at chapter 35, verse 34, so the last verse of the last chapter is, you shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell. I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. So the way this chapter has been set up, we left off from last week, is the Lord is in his home. This is that he's at home and he wants to bring his wife Israel into his home with him. We saw early on in the book of Numbers the unfaithful men at Peor, and here we contrast the faithful wives of the daughters of Zelophehad. So the idea is that our faithful husband, their faithful husband is in Israel, and we're to be like these faithful wives as we go to meet our loving husband. And that imagery is all over the Bible. We saw it in some songs a couple of years ago, Ephesians 5, and especially how the Bible ends, that the church is Christ's bride. And the reason marriage matters and all the details about marriage and some of the things we might find a bit odd at times compared to our culture is they're images of Christ's love for us and how we're to reciprocate that love and the role that Christ has to us responding to him. So you see Christ's intense love for us that draws us and a longing from us for him. Because if we know something about him, it draws our longing for him out of us. And the end goal is we live in his land forever. And it shows some of the kind of relationship of communion with God, communion with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, objectively, because of Christ's work, we have union with Christ. The Spirit has united us to Christ. But he wants more than that. He wants us to grow and mature so that subjectively we can grow in communion with him. That we desire his presence and a depth to that relationship. So we don't want to know stuff to know stuff. We want to know more about God to please him, to know him, to live for him, and not to be satisfied where we're at. Christ and his bride. Now, sometimes Christians say, oh, I don't like all that theology stuff. I have simple faith. Now, there's a kind of theology that is kind of proud and just like knowing football scores or something like that, just knowing facts, as if that was an end in itself. We want to know things because we want to know the Lord and we want to know how to please him. So imagine saying to your beloved, I think I know you well enough. Maybe you feel like that after a few decades, but when we're talking about God, we're talking about an eternal being. Imagine if someone asked me questions about Glad, like, what colour eyes does she have? What's her date of birth? What's she allergic to? What things does she like? I just went, we have a simple marriage. You take it a very superficial marriage. We want to know people increasingly as we spend time with them. And so it is with the Lord. That's why we want to grow. And we are not satisfied with the level that we are at with him now. It's not necessarily bad, but we want to just be deeper with him and to grow with him. So they help us to look forward. And in looking forward, the fourth thing is they help us to think about our land. Now, Christians have a land. And we're not to over-spiritualise things or under-spiritualise things. So two problems Christians fall into. The first is to spiritualise everything and speak about heaven and going to heaven when we die. As if, our bodies don't matter and sort of our spirits waft into heaven and remain that way. The second is to look at the promises to Israel and the land of Israel, as in the boundaries that we know where they are, on the plot of land on the east of the Mediterranean, as an end. And it ends with this split focus that some Christians have, that they talk about the church, which is that group that meets on Sundays all over the place, and then Israel, and that's another load of things that happen. And both of them are rightly critical of the other because they're both only half true. We have a promised land that the land of Israel was only pointing to. And Jesus walks with us in the wilderness, as he walked with them in their wilderness to the land. He walks with us in our wilderness that we're in now. It takes us into that promised land that is to come. So Hebrews 11, 1-2. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for the convictions of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. And then what he does through the rest of chapter 11 is he goes through the Old Testament history, or some of it, looking at these heroes of faith. There's some surprises in there. And he makes the point continually that if the land of Israel, he makes the point continually that the land of Israel was not their ultimate destination. But Moses' ultimate destination, that Abraham's hope, was not the land of Israel. It's an important stepping stone in the whole story that brings us to a future heavenly country. Hebrews 4 tells us that the rest is still waiting for, that Joshua did not bring them into the rest that was promised. And Revelation 21 and 22, the very end of the Bible, what happens is that we don't go to heaven. Well, actually, when you die, you do go to be with the Lord for now. But the way the Bible ends is heaven comes down to earth and says God's dwelling now is with us and our bodies are raised. And there's a hint of that even in this chapter. There's a passing reference to the year of Jubilee. So the Jubilee is the Sabbath 7 times 7, and all debts are lifted and the land returns back to its ancestor. So God gives Israel a land despite their sin and their poor choices, and he resets all that went wrong every 49 or 50 years. Now, of course, as you know, eventually they lose their land entirely. They're exiled from it. And that points us again to Christ, that Christ was exiled for us. He was cast out. We had this, there's a lot of outside of the camp in Numbers, isn't there? Christ was exiled from life. He was taken outside of the city wall and exiled from life so that we don't lose our inheritance. And by the Holy Spirit, we're united to him. We are married to him. We're in union with him so that we are heirs with Christ. Well, what is Christ that we can be an heir with? What is his that becomes mine? Well, everything. So we share what is his, the renewed world, the reordered, recreated world that comes from heaven to earth is ours, despite our sin and stupidity. And he walks with us now and takes us. He's taking us on that. Sometimes it feels like a convoluted route, but he's taking us to that land there. So the Christian hope is real and tangible. You will touch, see, smell, and taste it. And wonderfully, it's centered on Jesus Christ. He's the one that makes heaven heaven. What makes the new creation new, what makes it worth going to, is Jesus is there. People often say, well, I wonder if this is in the new creation, or that's in the new creation. We know food's there, that's good. But what makes it worth being there is Jesus is there. And that we have union with him. We want communion with him. We want to taste from them, even now. And this is why Numbers is so useful for Christians and churches. Now matters, but our now has to be shaped by then. So we need to be longing and thirsting for God now, and what he's holding out for us, those promises. Our destination is there. Not to be too, now matters, but we're not, this isn't where we end. This isn't our final destination. There's somewhere we go together. It's not about inner enlightenment, but a battle. We're in a battle together, and en route, Jesus is with us, keeping us until we reach there.